"Excuse me, young man," the flight attendant said coldly, though pretending to be polite. "First class is not for people like you, Jaden." The Calmac black boy blinked lightly, looking down at his first-class ticket before meeting her disdainful gaze. "I have a valid ticket," he replied softly. "I belong here." But Claudia just gave a mocking smile. "Either you leave on your own, or let security handle it." Little did she know the black boy she had just tried to humiliate was actually the son of the airline's owner, someone who would make her pay for her racist behavior. The small suitcase rolled gently across the glossy floor of the international airport, weaving through the busy crowd among the neatly dressed suits and fashionable dresses of the hurried travelers. A slender black boy walked with calm confidence that was Jaden Bennett, 17 years old, his bright black eyes hidden behind thin glasses, with a gentle smile and polite demeanor that made it easy to recognize his intelligence as he quietly observed the world around him. Today was a special day. Jaden had just completed his final semester at an esteemed high school with outstanding results and had received a full scholarship to a top university in the United States. It was not just a reward for years of hard study, but a testament to the perseverance of a black boy from a family with a poor but resilient past. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced around the vast airport. Everything seemed to unfold in slow motion, airport staff bustling around, directing passengers' announcements, echoing from the loudspeakers and colorful suitcases endlessly rolling on the baggage conveyor. Inside Jaden was a mix of excitement and nervousness, not just because this was his first-class flight, a special gift from his father to celebrate his academic achievement, but also because on the other side of this flight was a warm embrace from Victor Bennett, the father Jaden admired and loved the most. Victor Bennett, a name that commanded respect in the aviation industry. He was not only the owner of the airline Jaden was about to board, but also a symbol of overcoming adversity, from a poor boy working as an airplane cleaner to a mogul who built a renowned aviation empire. Yet to Jaden, he was simply Dad, the man who patiently explained tough math problems, who stayed up late with him during exam preparations, and who had always reminded him, "Your value doesn't lie in your skin color or your background, but in how you treat others." Jaden didn't like to flaunt that he was Victor Bennett's son to him. His father was just his father, not the airline owner, and he was just an ordinary student wanting to be seen for his abilities, not for the name Bennett on official papers. In fact, except for a few close family members, no one at this airport knew that he was the only son of Victor. In Jaden's hand was the first-class ticket, a small piece of paper, but with great significance. It wasn't a symbol of wealth, but a milestone, marking years of youthful struggle. "Enjoy it, deserve it," his father had said when he handed over the ticket. But deep inside, Jaden remained humble. No show-off, no airs of superiority for him. This flight was simply a journey home, to where family was to a warm dinner at the table, to laughter echoing through the kitchen, and to a father always ready to welcome him back. Jaden slowly made his way to the first-class lounge, his heart pounding in his chest. The plush leather chairs, the soft jazz music, and the rich aroma of coffee filled the quiet space. Jaden sat down, placing his hot chocolate on the table, and quickly texted his father, "I'm about to board the plane. Dad, hope to see you soon." The reply came almost instantly. "Enjoy your trip, son. I'll be waiting for you at home." Jaden smiled faintly. Everything seemed perfect, at least until he met Claudia Harper, the one who would turn this memorable flight into an unforgettable experience. Jaden had just hung up the phone, his fingers still lightly scrolling on the screen, when his gaze accidentally swept over the service counter across the room, where two flight attendants in neat uniforms were engaged in a casual conversation. One of them was Claudia Harper, the senior flight attendant with nearly 2 decades of experience on international commercial flights. Her dark blonde hair was neatly styled, and her sharp features and piercing eyes seemed to miss no detail of the passengers. The way she stood, adjusted her collar, or lightly smoothed the edge of her uniform, all conveyed an air of distant pride, an aloofness not born from passion for the job, but from the arrogance of someone who believes herself above the rest. From the moment she saw Jaden walk in with his suitcase, Claudia had frowned. Her eyes paused on the neatly dressed but simple black teenager making his way toward the luxurious seating area designated for special passengers. He wore no fancy blazer, no expensive watch, and no shiny leather shoes like the other frequent flyers who usually visited this area. All Jaden carried was a worn-out backpack and a ticket in his hand. But what caught Claudia's attention wasn't that, it was the color of his skin that made her raise her head a beat longer, her lips tightening into a familiar, deeply ingrained prejudice that colored her perception of people. Claudia leaned toward the colleague standing next to her, a younger flight attendant still busy organizing papers on the counter, then whispered in a dry, clipped tone just loud enough for it to be heard, but still carrying a clear sense of mockery. "First class really is accessible to anyone these days." The younger attendant glanced at Jaden instinctively, her eyes briefly flustered, unsure whether to smile back at the remark or to just ignore it. She lowered her head to continue her work, unwilling to respond. But that silence didn't stop Claudia from continuing to watch Jaden with the scrutinizing gaze from afar. It wasn't the first time Claudia had subtly revealed her discriminatory attitude toward passengers who didn't fit the unspoken standards she had set long ago. Passengers who dressed too casually, those who weren't white, or simply anyone who entered first class without radiating wealth and power. She quickly assigned them a cold and unwelcoming gaze, sometimes even showing blatant detachment in her service to her people, like Jaden. Young blacks, simple in appearance, were definitely out of place in Claudia's mind. He belonged in the cramped economy section, not in the expensive space reserved for busy businessmen or high-ranking officials. Jaden, though instinctively sensing the strange looks from the service counter, remained calm. He took a sip of hot chocolate, his eyes scanning unread messages on his phone, reassuring himself that perhaps he was overthinking. After all, this wasn't the first time he had faced such looks, those seemingly harmless glances that nevertheless made one's heart tighten. Little by little, Jaden had long learned to ignore them, to move on as if they had never existed. But this time he didn't know that those eyes would not only linger in scrutiny, but would lead to a series of discriminatory actions and humiliating moments on the very FL he had been eagerly anticipating. Claudia, from behind the service counter, cast another glance at Jaden before turning her attention to the upcoming flight's VIP guest list. She lightly ran her finger across the columns of names, her lips curling slightly as she silently confirmed her suspicion. There must be some mistake, because someone like that boy could never appear on a first-class guest list. Not according to the narrow standards she had held for years, and from that moment she silently set herself a task that no one had assigned to her, to find out who Jaden really was and push him back to the place she believed he deserved, a cool breeze from the air conditioner wafted through the taquab the quiet lounge. But Jaden remained unaware that the real storm was still ahead, starting with the cold stare that had just passed over his back and would soon transform into harsh words, cruel actions. Once he boarded the plane, Jaden had no idea that the scrutinizing gaze had followed him like a cold shadow from the waiting room all the way to the announcement calling first-class passengers to board the plane. He stood up, gently tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, and pulled his suitcase toward the line of people calmly moving toward the boarding gate, his heart racing with the excitement of being reunited with his father after months of separation. In Jaden's mind, this flight was the beginning of a new chapter where every effort would be rewarded, a place where he could walk proudly among other successful people without shame or hesitation. However, just a few steps ahead, everything began to feel awkward. At the boarding gate, Claudia Harper was already standing, her face covered in flawless makeup, her lips gently pressed into the polite smile she reserved for each passenger like a line from a well. Rehearsed script, she checked each person's ticket with proper courtesy, offering warm greetings and occasionally adding a few formal pleasantries. A middle-aged man in a light-colored suit who had just walked past received well wishes for a safe flight in a voice as sweet as honey. A blonde woman carrying a designer handbag was greeted with a slight bow and a flawless, friendly smile from Claudia. But when it came to Jay's turn, the smile faded in an instant. Claudia glanced down at the ticket he handed over, and the moment she saw the words "First Class" printed clearly on it, her eyebrows slightly arched, as if she had discovered something so absurd that it was almost impossible to accept without a greeting or even a nod. She scanned him from his lightly curly black hair, over his simple hoodie down to his sneakers, which had begun to fade, a look that seemed to confirm to herself one last time that this boy, standing before her, was entirely unfit for this ticket. Claudia took a slight breath, quickly regaining her composure. She didn't outright reject him or show open hostility, but the way she spoke, the exaggerated, polite tone, made the subtle denial hidden behind each word unmistakable. "Are you sure you're at the right gate? Economy is over there," she said, gesturing toward the long line behind them as if that was where Jaden truly belonged. Jaden hesitated for a moment. He blinked, looked down at the ticket still in his hand, and then looked up, speaking as calmly and politely as possible. "Yes, I'm at the right gate. My ticket clearly states first class." He raised the ticket a little higher so CLAA could see the bold, unmistakable print. But instead of thoroughly checking and offering a professional apology if she had made a mistake, Claudia only curled her lips, her cold eyes scanning Jaden once more, this time with an unmistakable air of doubt. She drawled, her voice monotone, no longer looking at the ticket but staring directly at him. There might be some mistake in the system. First class isn't for everyone, that statement, though, wrapped in a soft tone, cut through the air like a thin, sharp blade. Jaden felt his ears burn, but he kept his face neutral, gripping the strap of his backpack to hold back the discomfort rising in his chest behind him. A few people in line began to whisper their curious gazes mixed with raised eyebrows, silently judging some eyed Jaden as if weighing whether he truly deserved to be in this position, while others turned to Claudia, waiting to see how this little drama would unfold. Jaden took a deep breath, looking straight at Claudia, his voice calm yet firm. "My ticket is perfectly valid. You can check again if you need to, but I'm certain I'm in the right place in that moment." Their eyes locked, One side was the cold stare of someone carrying years of arrogance and deep-rooted prejudice. The other was the composed gaze of a boy who knew his worth well enough not to bow to doubtful, malicious words. But Jaden had no idea that those words wouldn't deter Claudia. On the contrary, his unflinching confidence only seemed to fuel her desire to push the matter further, to see just how much this boy could endure before the challenges she had silently prepared would break him. And this was just the beginning of a series of discomforts that would last throughout the flight, a journey where Jaden, though accustomed to discriminatory stares, could never have imagined that he would face such blatant prejudice in the very first-class cabin of the airline his father had built. In the brief moment following Jaden's calm response, the atmosphere around the boarding gate seemed to thicken. The crowd behind him moved slowly, the sound of rolling suitcases scraping on the tile floor. The quiet whispers of a few nearby passengers starting to rise like ink stains spreading across a still surface. But at the center of all this attention, only two gazes were locked. One from Jaden, calm, but resolute; the other from Claudia, cold and calculating, as if she were contemplating how far she should block his way without crossing the line of power she was so accustomed to wielding. Jay gently raised his ticket higher, holding it firmly with both hands. His voice was soft but clear, as though he wanted all those standing nearby to hear. Not as a plea, but to reaffirm his legal right. "I'm sure there's no mistake. This is a first-class ticket, purchased in advance with all the details in order. If you want, I'm happy to wait while you verify it in the system." He still smiled gently, maintaining the politeness always had, but in his bright dark eyes there was a steadfast look that made it clear to anyone that this was not a boy easily pushed into submission by a few mocking words or an unfriendly attitude. Yet it was precisely this calm demeanor that irritated Claudia. Even more, she had not expected this in Claudia's mind. People like Jaden Young, black-dressed simply when stopped at a first-class G gate, would instinctively back down, muttering apologies and quietly turning away to head toward the economy-class cabin behind the place she believed they truly belonged. But Jaden didn't do that. And that was what pricked Claudia's stubborn pride. She pursed her lips slightly, a small gesture, but enough to make her meticulously painted lips curl into a distinctly mocking shape. She tilted her head, her gaze flicking back to the ticket as though searching for some invisible flaw to latch on to. After a few seconds of silence, not finding any crack to exploit, she decided to switch to a different tactic, dragging out the situation with subtle denials, just enough to let Jaden know he was unwelcome, but not so direct that it could be deemed unprofessional. "How strange." Claudia slowly spoke, her voice dragging out each word as if to add more suspicion to the already tense atmosphere. "In these times, the system often makes mistakes. This first-class cabin, usually isn't for people like you." She purposely paused at the final phrase, leaving it suspended in the air, like a dull blade, still sharp enough to cut into the listener's heart with its vague insinuation, as if Jaden's presence here at this moment was so absurd it needed to be questioned. Jaden felt his heartbeat slow, not out of fear or confusion, but because he was forcing himself to suppress a rising tide of emotion. The familiar feeling that people like him often faced suspicion, judgment, and disdain simply because of his skin color or his appearance not fitting the mainstream standards. But Jaden also clearly remembered every word his father had taught him, that in moments like these, what mattered most wasn't winning an argument, but preserving his dignity, so no one could ever touch the self-respect that no one had the right to take away. Therefore, he stood his ground, his face remaining calm, his eyes never leaving Claudia. His voice still gentle, but each word came out clear and decisive, as if emphasizing the final pieces of an undeniable truth. I believe the system works very accurately, and I also believe that my presence here with this ticket is entirely valid if anything is unclear. Feel free to double-check. I'll wait in that moment. The air became strangely still. People around began to look at Jaden differently. A few older passengers whispered to each other. Some frowned. Others held back a sigh. No one spoke up, but the discomfort slowly spread like a thin mist, weaving through every gesture, every look, and the slowing footsteps in the line of passengers trailing behind Claudia. Sensing the situation was becoming somewhat awkward, but with her nature unwilling to let anyone get the better of her, especially not a boy, correcting her in front of so many people straightened her back a bit more. Her gaze growing colder, her voice even, and yet tinged with visible impatience. Then you can just stand here and wait. I'll check again. But don't expect the outcome to be what you think. With that, Claudia turned toward the screen to check the list, leaving Jaden standing there alone, with his ticket in hand, and the eyes of dozens of people behind him focused on him as if they were waiting to see how this strange story would unfold, whether the black boy truly belonged in first class, or whether he would eventually be sent back to economy class, just as the prejudiced glances had expected from the start. Only Jaden wasn't waiting for that answer with anxiety. He knew he belonged here, and he was ready to wait no matter how long it took, even with hundreds of skeptical eyes on him. Jaden stood there holding the ticket firmly, as if clinging to an undeniable truth that no one could deny. His gaze remained steadfast as he watched Claudia's back moving swiftly toward the check-in screen, her figure radiating urgency, yet unable to hide the frustration simmering with every step she took. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, much less taken anyone's spot. Yet each passing second thickened the atmosphere around him as glances from all directions began to focus on him. The people behind him who had initially stood in a quiet and polite line now started to whisper their furtive glances, growing bolder as if Jaden's patience itself was the reason the line was standing still longer than usual. Some shrugged their gazes quickly, darting over to Jaden before quickly looking away, as if afraid that lingering too long might pull them into a situation that had nothing to do with them. Others sighed loudly, making a point to emphasize their discomfort over the delayed flight, all because of a boy still arguing over a seat even worse. There were quiet head shakes and subtle mocking smiles from somewhere behind, as if this was nothing more than a temporary amusement in a space usually accustomed to absolute quiet and decorum. Jaden could feel every eye on him from all sides, each stare like an invisible needle, pricking his skin, reaching deep into his chest, making his breath just a bit heavier. But he stood tall, keeping a calmness so unshakable, it seemed almost unreal, because he understood that if he showed any sign of hesitation, if he bowed his head or stepped back, it would confirm all the doubts those looks had already placed on his presence here in the first place. Meanwhile, Claudia had returned holding a tablet showing a passenger list, her expression still tinged with a vague sense of satisfaction, as if she had found the perfect reason to validate the mistake she had convinced herself of from the start. She approached Jaden standing tall, as if reclaiming all the authority she thought she had, lowering her head just enough to ensure her voice stayed between the two of them, but deliberately loud enough for nearby passengers to catch every word. Clearly, I'll say this one last time. Young man, She stretched the word, young man, with a tone thick with sarcasm, then leaned in slightly as if whispering a secret, but ensuring others could. Eavesdrop this place is really not for people like you. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to call security. The words, though, softly spoken, felt as heavy as a stone pressing down on an atmosphere already taut as a stretched wire. Jaden heard every word echoing in his mind, each one like a stone dropping into a tranquil pond that he had been trying to keep calm, causing ripples to form. But even in that moment, he showed no reaction. His gaze unwavering, deeper and sharper than usual, as if to send a message to Claudia that she could use her power to make things difficult, but she would never have the strength to take away his self-respect. Jaden lowered his ticket to chest level, gently turning it so the passenger information faced Claudia, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through her spiteful words like a sharp blade. I don't think this is how a head stewardess should speak to a first-class passenger, but I'm willing to wait here. And if necessary, I'll let security verify for me either way. I'm not leaving when I've done nothing wrong. A silence descended over the area, stretching a few seconds longer, as if everyone needed the time to absorb the words Jaden had just spoken. No one expected the boy to remain so composed under the scrutinizing eyes, the pressure from the head of the cabin crew, the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to swallow anyone who wasn't strong enough. Yet Jaden stood there like a small pillar amid a silent storm of prejudice. Claudia pressed her lips tightly together, her eyes briefly flicking toward the crowd behind her, clearly noticing that the check was drawing more attention than she had intended, but she also realized that if she let Jaden walk past here, everything she had tried to do, the doubt, the sarcasm, and the overwhelming power she had been wielding would turn into a joke in front of the other passengers. And so she gave a small nod, coldly uttering one last sentence before signaling for her colleague to contact security. Well, then wait a little longer. Let's see who truly doesn't belong here. A faint smile crept across Claudia's lips as if she had just made a decisive move in a game of chess, unaware that from this moment on, the game was slipping out of her control. Jaden remained standing still, his hands lightly gripping the straps of his backpack, his gaze directed at Claudia like a silent challenge to the growing absurdity unfolding before him. But just moments after Claudia's final words rang out like a knife, sealing the first round of confrontation, two security guards in airport uniforms appeared from the far end of the hallway leading to the plane's door. The sound of their shoes lightly tapping on the floor echoed steadily and coldly like the rhythm of an invisible verdict, already determined, causing the nearby passengers to tilt their heads and glance toward them with a mix of curiosity, and apprehension. Claudia turned around and walked toward them with an air of authority, as if she had finally acquired the weapon to completely end the stubbornness Jaden was showing. She exchanged a few quick words, quiet enough so no one could hear, but deliberately kept a stern expression and formal demeanor that made outsiders believe the situation was far more serious than it actually was. Jaden remained still, his calm eyes following every movement of Claudia and the security personnel, fully aware of what was about to happen, though he held on to a faint hope that everything would be resolved peacefully once the truth was confirmed. But when one of the officers approached, slightly bowing his head before speaking in a polite but firm tone, that hope was immediately shattered. Without mercy, please follow us. We'll guide you to the assigned seat. Jaden tightened the straps of his backpack biting his lip for a brief moment of hesitation, as if he wanted to give one final explanation, but he soon realized that any words at this point were just pebbles thrown at a glass wall already fogged with prejudice. He didn't shout, argue, or continue to debate, because in the eyes of everyone watching from down the hallway, not everyone truly wanted to hear the truth, and not everyone would stand with him in a situation like this. Some people looked at him with pity as if wanting to offer comfort, but hesitant to speak up, afraid of getting involved in such a sensitive matter in a public space. Others frowned and shook their heads in annoyance, as if Jaden was the cause of the delay disturbing the peaceful order of the first-class cabin. But there were also many indifferent, cold stares, people turning away, as if it were someone else's business, just a trivial matter not worth caring about. In the long journey ahead, Jaden took a deep breath, maintaining his composed demeanor, and then nodded gently. He followed the two security guards, his back straight, but each step heavier than ever they escorted him through the row of seats, under the scrutinizing gazes of the passengers on both sides, who seemed to be waiting to see if the little black boy would hang his head in shame or walk with his head held high in silent humiliation. The feeling of being dragged away from a place that was rightfully his was an indescribable shame. It wasn't because Jaden felt inferior, nor was it because he was embarrassed to be moved to the economy section in front of dozens of watching eyes, but because of the blatant injustice unfolding without anyone. Having the courage to step forward and speak up, no one said a word to stop the chain of biased actions. It was as if, in their eyes, this was simply an unfortunate mistake, or worse. Something that was to be expected when the door between the first-class and economy cabins closed behind him. Jaden slumped into the narrow window seat, his eyes fixed on the tiny window where the sun's fingers lightly tapped against the fragile glass. His lips were pressed tightly together, forcing himself not to let out any sound, because he knew that if he allowed a tear or a sigh to escape, the strength he had built up since the beginning of the journey would collapse in an instant. Only when he was sure he had fully composed himself did Jaden take out his phone, his fingers gently swiping across the screen, typing each word steadily and calmly, just as he had faced everything up to this point. "Dad, they moved me to economy. The flight attendant said my ticket was a mistake, but I'm sure it's not. I don't want to make a scene, but this is really unfair after sending the message." Jaden leaned back into his seat and closed his eyes for a few seconds, trying to regain the balance that had been disrupted by Claudia and the invisible system of prejudice. He didn't know what would happen next, nor was he sure if there was anything else he could do other than wait. But deep down he knew that his father, Victor Bennett, had never let injustice go unchallenged, and if he had sent out a cry for help, Jaden believed that justice would not stand on the sidelines. Meanwhile, Claudia, on the other side of the dividing door, was still smiling lightly, her gaze absent-mindedly sweeping across the first-class cabin, as if she had just finished dealing with a small inconvenience, completely unaware that what she had just done would spark a much larger storm than any flight she had ever served inside the cramped economy cabin, where the soft light from the small windows barely illuminated the faces of passengers who were either focused on their phones or sneaking in a nap. Jaden let out a quiet sigh as the message he had sent was acknowledged by his father with a scene notification. Just seconds later, no further response followed. No long, winded questions. No meaningless expressions of worry. But Jaden knew all too well that when his father went silent, that was when he was beginning to act, and indeed just minutes later, while Jaden, tried to focus on the blue sky outside the window to calm himself. Not far away above the cockpit, the emergency internal phone suddenly rang. The brief, sharp, and decisive bell was enough to make the captain a man in his 50s, with sharp eyes who had piloted hundreds of intercontinental flights, furrow his brow as he glanced at the caller ID. The number displayed didn't need a name, as a quick look told him it was a priority line from the very top levels of the airline's management. And what stood out even more was the name associated with the phone number. Victor Bennett, less than 10 seconds after picking up the captain's expression, changed entirely. The voice on the other end, though gentle and warm, was as firm as a sharp knife slicing across glass, clear, precise, and to the point. Victor Bennett was not the type of person to lose his temper or lose control, but when he spoke, everyone understood that his requests were not suggestions. They were orders. "I just received information from my son, Victor," said each word pouring into the stillness of the cockpit. "His name is Jaden Bennett. He has been moved from his first-class seat, despite his ticket being entirely valid. I don't care what reasons have been given to justify it, but I want you to verify this immediately and ensure that my son is treated with the rights he deserves. Also," he paused as though emphasizing the point, "pay attention to the way the head flight attendant is handling this flight. I want to know every detail." The captain immediately jotted a note down, nodding, despite knowing that Victor couldn't see the gesture, and responded with absolute professionalism, laced with the usual caution when receiving directives from someone so high up the chain. "Yes, Mr. Bennett, I will handle this personally immediately." When the call ended, the captain placed the phone back on the desk, his gaze turning toward the flight path screen ahead, though his mind silently drifted toward the passenger cabin behind the thick wind-proof door. He knew very well that from the moment he received that call, this was no longer an ordinary flight. And more importantly, the person responsible for the mess that had just been reported, the one at the top of the list who would be held accountable, was none other than Claudia Harper. A few minutes later, a summons was sent down to the service cabin. Claudia was standing in the small kitchen area behind the first-class cabin, adjusting her hair in the small mirror attached to the mini fridge, a faint smile playing on her lips as if she were still basking in the afterglow of her victory. She had successfully removed a disruptive element, ensuring that the special cabin remained quiet and up to standing. Just as she always believed it should be to Claudia. Everything was in order, and now all that was left was to serve the remainder of the long flight, silently basking in the approval of the passengers who shared her views. However, when a young flight attendant approached, slightly bowing, as he quietly called out, "Miss Claudia, the captain requests your presence in the cockpit. There's something urgent to discuss." The smile on Claudia's face faltered for a moment, a rare occurrence, since the captain rarely called for a flight attendant in the middle of a flight unless it was something truly important, and in that instant a vague intuition of something shifting beyond her control flitted through her mind, still with her usual knack for controlling the situation. She quickly regained her confident demeanor, adjusted her uniform, and walked briskly toward the pit. Her outward calm so perfect that no one could have guessed the fleeting unease that had just crossed her eyes yet. With every step, her pace slowed as she passed through the passenger cabin, where a few pairs of eyes watched, some accidentally, others intentionally, almost as if they sensed that the story wasn't over. An undercurrent was beginning to rise from a place Claudia never expected. And when the cockpit door closed behind her, a whole new chapter of this flight had officially begun, and this time she was no longer the one in control when the cockpit door closed behind her, leaving behind the echo of Claudia's footsteps. The passenger cabin began to stir with an unspoken unease. The atmosphere in the small room suddenly grew heavy, thick, like a dense fog that refused to dissipate. The captain lifted his head from the controls, his gaze no longer warm as usual, but tinged with caution and indifference. He motioned for Claudia to sit in the vacant seat across from him, his voice low but clear, devoid of unnecessary words or ambiguity. Each sentence seemed carefully weighed as if to avoid any further mistakes in a series of events that had already gone. I just received a direct call from Mr. Victor Bennett, he said, pausing mid-sentence, so the announcement could sink into the now silent room. He stopped and locked eyes with Claudia, making sure she understood the gravity of what was about to be said. He wants to verify the crew's handling of this flight, specifically regarding the case of passenger Jaden Bennett. At first, when Claudia heard the familiar name of the airline's head, she only blinked slightly, her hands clasped together on her lap in an attempt to maintain her usual composed demeanor as if this were just a routine business discussion. But when the captain deliberately paused again to emphasize Jaden Bennett, Mr. Victor Bennett's only son, it was as if blood drained from Claudia's face in that moment, making her pale skin even more ashen, as though her entire body had just been pulled into a freezing, bottomless abyss. Her eyes widened and her lips trembled, but no sound came out immediately, as if her brain were still struggling to process the information to make sure she hadn't misheard or that her mind hadn't fabricated it. A bitter lump of dread formed in her throat, forcing Claudia to swallow hard in an attempt to regain her usually sharp voice. But now it cracked into weak fragments. His son. The boss's son. The captain gave a slight nod, not offering any further words. His gaze still cold and unyielding, as if he knew that any attempt at justification was already far too late. As for Claudia, it felt as if someone had just pushed her into an abyss. Her hand gripped the edge of her jacket so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her mind spinning between the shock and a growing sense of regret that spread like oil. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this out of control. After nearly 20 years in the air, she had always been the one to command the atmosphere in the cabin. Her authority unquestioned, an experienced headlight attendant who could silence the rowdiest passengers with just a look. She was the one who could enforce service standards without anyone daring to question her. Yet now her sharp eyes had failed her, and she hadn't recognized that the teenager she had dismissed from first class, the one she had subtly humiliated with her disdainful attitude from the moment he boarded until he was escorted off, was the only son of the man who had the power to erase her career with a single cold nod from behind the office door in the seconds that followed. As the cockpit remained silent, with only the hum of the engines passing through the soundproof walls, Claudia forced herself to stand up bowing, to thank the captain mechanically before hurrying out. Her temples throbbed with rapid heartbeats, and her usually confident strides now faltered unsteady as if walking on thin ice. She walked through first class where a few passengers had already started to watch her with curiosity. They didn't know exactly what had transpired, but it seemed they sensed that the conversation in the cockpit had not been simple. She continued passing through business class, her eyes scanning toward the door leading to economy class as if searching for the target of her sudden urgent correction, though she had no idea where to begin. Until then, Every action Claudia had taken with Jaden had been calculated coldly, following a familiar pattern where those deemed unfit were pushed out of her space. No explanations needed, no final apologies required. But now, for the first time in many years, Claudia was forced to ask herself, could those actions be undone with a simple apology when faced with the boy whose father had enough power to end her career? All with a mere cold gesture. Her pace quickened, her palms damp with sweat. And in her mind, only one thought echoed, repeating like a warning bell in the dark. I have to find that boy right now. But deep down, Claudia knew well that some mistakes once made could never be undone, no matter how many apologies were offered, and a greater storm was already brewing just ahead. The ripple from the small wave she herself had created only just beginning to form. Claudia quickly walked past the rows of seats in the economy section, her eyes scanning the aisle, her palms cold, as if her entire body was being submerged in the thin ice of fear. Never in her long tenure as a headlight attendant had she felt every step so heavy. The passengers' faces looked at her as she passed, some indifferent, some curious, but none of them knew that the woman who was considered the epitome of professionalism on these long-haul flights was now caught in the most silently fierce crisis of her career. And then her gaze stopped at the window seat, where a small black teenager was sitting quietly, leaning slightly against the backrest, his hand still loosely holding his phone as if waiting for another response from his powerful father on the other end of the line. In that moment, Claudia instinctively froze, standing still for a few seconds looking at the boy who just moments ago she had felt entitled to judge and dismiss from first class with a few cold words and eyes full of prejudice. Now knowing who he was, knowing that the name Bennett was tied to absolute power on this very flight and beyond that. Over her own career, Claudia felt as though she had just awakened from a dream, her arrogant self-confidence shattered. A self-confidence she had spent years building, but it was too late to awaken. She swallowed hard once more to regain some semblance of calm, then walked awkwardly toward Jaden, her posture far from the usual authoritative stance she was known for. When she got closer, she bent slightly to be at his eye level, her lips forming a strained smile, so forced that if one paid attention, the struggle behind it was clearly visible. Her voice softened an unfamiliar softness that didn't come from genuine kindness but from the confusion and worry she was desperately trying to hide. You, Jaden, right? I really apologize for the inconvenience earlier. There may have been a slight misunderstanding, if you'd like. We're happy to invite you back to first class immediately to ensure your utmost comfort for the rest of the flight. Jaden looked up, his eyes meeting Claudia's gaze, which was trying too hard to seem friendly. There was no sign of irritation, no sharp glare in response, just a calmness that made Claudia feel even more awkward. He smiled faintly enough to be polite, but just as enough to show the clear distance between basic courtesy and the cold indifference that was hard to hide. Thank you, but I'm fine. I'll stay here for the rest of the flight. The simple, light reply felt as though he didn't want to waste another second on the belated efforts to salvage the situation. But to Claudia, it was like a sharp blow cutting through all her plans. She hadn't expected Jaden to refuse so calmly without blame, without questioning, just firmly turning down the chance to return to first class with a short and resolute sentence. Claudia blinked, trying to swallow down the rising feeling of embarrassment that was choking her, and quickly clung to anything that might salvage the awkward apology she was desperately trying to make. She adjusted her smile. even more strained than before, then continued in a low, quiet voice full of urge. Mary, if you need anything else, drinks, snacks, or blankets, or anything that could make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let me know. I will ensure that you're served as best as we can. We truly regret the unfortunate incident earlier. Jaden tilted his head slightly, still holding the polite smile, but showing no excitement toward her rushed and reluctant offers to him. It was all just formality, a distorted mask of fear disguised as professional service. Slowly he shook his head, his voice steady and calm but gentle. Thank you very much, but I don't need anything. I'll be fine this time. Claudia was truly frozen for a few seconds, as if she finally realized that all her efforts to make amends were too late and worse. There was no way to erase the cold looks and polite rejections that had been exchanged. Standing there, she could hear the steady hum of the engines outside, the scattered footsteps of passengers behind her, and the soft rustling of pages from someone nearby. And all these sounds seemed to deepen the growing discomfort swelling in her chest. Claudia gave a slight nod, as if allowing herself to retreat before the embarrassment completely overtook her professional exterior, which was already beginning to crack. She turned and slowly walked back to the first-class cabin, feeling the eyes on her back, half pitying, half smug, and ahead of her a long, unending journey of a flight she would never forget. Claudia turned back toward the first-class cabin, but from behind her, the gazes of the passengers in the economy class continued to follow her silently, persistently, as if they wanted to ensure that what they had just witnessed was not a fleeting scene, but a real story unfolding on a flight that was once seen as a symbol of perfection, luxury, and absolute fairness. No one spoke as Claudia walked, but the atmosphere on the flight had completely changed. Passengers who had previously silently observed the exchange between the young black boy and the most powerful flight attendant on board now began to lean in and whisper among themselves, their murmurs spreading like tiny ripples across a calm lake, subtle yet enough to stir the still waters that had once seemed serene. A middle-aged man sitting in the row directly across from Jaden shook his head, leaned down, and whispered to the woman beside him, his voice low but loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. Unbelievable! The boy is polite, has a valid ticket, and yet he treated like that. It's just disgraceful. Behind Jaden, a young woman, probably only a few years older than him, leaned forward slightly and spoke softly in a voice filled with genuine kindness, as though afraid of disturbing him, but unable to hold back her feelings of injustice at what she had just witnessed. You did great more composed than many adults could be in that situation. Don't let them make you feel like you're wrong when you clearly did nothing wrong. Jaden turned his head, his gaze meeting the gentle, encouraging smile of the young woman. He gave a small nod of thanks, a faint but sincere smile, appearing at the corners of his lips, and in that brief moment, the overwhelming silence and sorrow that had engulfed him since being moved to economy class seemed to soften just a little. Not far from him sat an elderly woman, small in stature, with her silver hair neatly tied up. She tilted her head slightly and looked at Jaden through the seats in front of her. Her gaze was no longer one of curiosity as it had been earlier, but now contained a sincere sympathy mixed with a hint of sorrow that she couldn't hide. She pursed her lips and then shook her head at the man sitting next to her in this day and age to still see such blatant discrimination. It's really sad that Bo doesn't deserve to be treated like that. No one does. Jaden overheard bits and pieces of the murmurs around him. And though he didn't actively listen, still keeping his gaze directed out the window as if he didn't want to pay attention to what was going on around him, a strange warmth began to creep into his heart. The sense that he wasn't entirely alone on this flight, that even through the gentlest of words, the softest of glances, someone noticed. The injustice he was facing as time went on. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to split into two clear opposing sides. On one side were those who didn't care, who simply wanted their flight to go smoothly and on time, their eyes drifting away as if they neither heard nor saw anything and wanted no part in it. But on the other side, and this side seemed to be growing, as time passed, were those who began to feel indignant on John's behalf. They started to whisper about Claudia's unprofessional behavior, about how she had tried to remove a polite and composed boy from his rightful seat simply because of her narrow-minded prejudices, and then came back to him in a flustered, clumsy manner, a far cry from the composed demeanor she had shown earlier. Even a man sitting near the aisle, who had been quietly observing, suddenly whispered to his companion, "I thought this kind of thing only happened in the news. Never thought I'd witness it firsthand on my own flight, and all of those words, those gazes, the soft shakes of heads, or the frowns of indignation, though no one directly confronted Claudia, still acted like invisible threads that tightened around the air every time she walked past. No need for anyone to point fingers or call her out. Just the subtle yet powerful shift from the collective passengers was enough for Claudia to realize she no longer had control over this space as she once had. As for Jaden, he still sat there gazing out the window, his eyes following the white clouds drifting lazily beneath the wings of the plane, tearing through the wind under the afternoon sun. Though his heart still carried the weight of frustration, somewhere inside, a small flicker of hope began to grow. Not everyone turned their back in situations like this. Not everyone chose silence as their ally in the face of injustice. And sometimes that's all it takes for someone to persevere just a little longer, to hold on to their self-respect. Until the very last moment of the journey, the whispering waves had yet to completely settle in the economy-class cabin, when suddenly the familiar, steady voice of the captain echoed through the airplane's PA system, cutting the furs through the unfinished conversations, causing every gaze to turn upward toward the cabin's ceiling, as if for that brief moment the entire aircraft had come to a halt to listen. Normally, passengers would only hear announcements about altitude, weather conditions at the destination, or estimated landing times. But this time, it was different. The captain's tone, more seriously than usual, immediately made many passengers sense that something was amiss. Passengers, he began each word carefully enunciated, as if ensuring no one would miss any detail of this important announcement. We would like to inform you that following a direct request from the senior management of the airline, all crew members and service staff on today's flight will undergo a full review of their service and conduct procedures throughout the journey to ensure there is absolutely no discrimination of any kind. The cabin fell silent. The unusual nature of the announcement made the already tense atmosphere stirred by Jaden's incident seem to freeze over passengers who had only dared to whisper among themselves, now exchanged surprised, even intrigued looks. The words discrimination had been spoken out loud through the PA system. Directly addressing an issue everyone had just witnessed, even without naming names. It was clear to everyone what the announcement referred to. We will not tolerate any unprofessional behavior, favoritism, or exclusion toward any passengers on our flights. Any complaints will be taken seriously and addressed accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation and understanding." As the announcement ended, the whispering in the cabin resumed even more hurried and intense than before. Many passengers smirked, nodding as though they'd predicted the unfolding events. Some leaned over to their colleagues or companions to quietly confirm the strange situation playing out before them. But all these sounds seemed to fade in comparison to the sensation slowly tightening around Claudia, as though an invisible noose was gradually pulling tighter around her neck, making each breath feel harder to take in the first-class cabin where she had just returned from her awkward attempt to make amends with Jaden. Claudia's hands, once steady in serving the meal tray, now trembled slightly. The professionalism she had prided herself on. For years, her cold, composed exterior began to crack like fragile glass under the pressure. She couldn't control her eyes. Quickly scanned the cabin, trying to gauge how many passengers had caught on. How many had understood that the target of the captain's formal announcement was none other than herself. And indeed, it wasn't hard to spot the glances subtle, but full of meaning. A few passengers looked up from their books or entertainment screens, casting pleading glances at Claudia with inscrutable half-smiles. Others raised an eyebrow, sipping their wine, seemingly enjoying the free spectacle unfolding in the air. Some, however, sat silently, their eyes fixed toward the rear of the cabin, where the black teenager whom they had seen being escorted away just moments ago sat quietly by the window, a clear reminder that the situation could not be overlooked. Claudia tightened her grip on the small napkin in her hand, her nails digging into the soft fabric as though trying to reassure herself that everything was still under control. But deep down, she knew that it had gone too far. Once the plane landed, every eye and question would be on her. And Victor Bennett, the man at the head of the airline, would be waiting at the destination with the most straightforward answer to the series of actions she had thought would pass unnoticed, like so many others before them. At this moment, every minute on the flight felt longer, stretching time to add weight to the growing fear that slowly consumed Claudia's mind. All the things she had once considered power. Her confidence, her experience now felt like a fragile shell, being slowly worn away under the scrutiny of the passengers, under the calm, quiet gaze of the boy she had once deemed unfit. And above all, under the towering shadow of the father who was silently tightening the grip of justice from the ground below. And somewhere deep inside, Claudia knew that this flight would have no landing spot for her pride. Time dragged on, feeling like it stretched into eternity since the cold announcement from the captain and throughout the remainder of the flight. Although Claudia tried to maintain a professional appearance, not for a single moment could she quell the anxiety gnawing at her from within. Every step she took down the aisle felt like walking over the shattered remnants of pride that had been broken, and every glance that passed her by felt like a silent knife twisting into her already crumbling self-esteem. She knew full well everything had only just begun, and the ending waiting down below on the ground would not be gentle. When the plane touched down on the runway, no one hurried to stand up. As usual, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, perhaps due to the exhaustion from the long flight, but more so because everyone was quietly awaiting what they had long anticipated. The silence lasted until the plane doors swung open. And in that moment, as the door moved, the air around them seemed to shudder with the presence of the man who was revered by the entire airline, Victor Bennett, tall-dressed in a meticulously tailored dark suit, and wearing rimless glasses that concealed his cold, sharp eyes, stepped onto the plane with a composed yet commanding demeanor, as if he belonged in every inch of space aboard the aircraft, as if nothing happening on this plane could escape his control behind Victor. Two senior executives from the airline followed their faces equally, stern, unable to hide the silent tension, as if they too were witnessing an impending storm about to land. No one spoke. Not a single passenger moved. Every eye was fixed on the aisle, following each of Victor's deliberate steps, heavy like lead, as he made his way straight toward the economy section. Without hesitation, he stopped beside Jaden's seat, and his usual cold gaze softened instantly when he saw his son still sitting there. His small yet steady shoulders, his face remarkably calm, despite everything he had been through without asking much. Victor leaned down slight. Placing a hand gently on Jaden's shoulder. His voice was low yet heavy with meaning, loud enough for those nearby to hear each word. Clearly, "Are you okay?" Jaden looked up at his father, his gaze calm with a hint of weariness, but there was a spark of renewed faith shining in his eyes. He nodded gently, replying softly, "I'm fine. Dad." Victor smiled faintly, not saying anything more, just squeezing his son's shoulder lightly as if to affirm that from this moment on the burden would no longer be Jaden to carry. Then he straightened up, his eyes hardening once again as he turned toward the first-class cabin, as though remembering something that needed immediate attention. At that very moment, Claudia was already standing at the end of the aisle, her face pale but still forcing a faint smile like a drowning person who had just found a life raft in the cold sea. But when Victor's gaze met hers, that smile vanished, crumbling like foam, leaving behind nothing but a hollow emptiness on her stunned face. Victor moved forward slowly but surely. Until he was just a few steps away from Claudia, there was no urgency in his voice, but each word he spoke felt like a hammer striking down into the already heavy silence. "I want to clarify something in front of everyone on this flight." He stopped scanning the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the passengers, as though ensuring no one missed a single word of what he was about to say. "The issue here is not because that boy is my son." Victor spoke slowly, his voice calm but as cold as steel. "It's because every passenger, regardless of age, skin color, or background, deserves to be treated with the same respect on this flight, and today you failed to do that." His words fell into a suffocating silence. No more. Whispers, no more averted glances. Now all eyes were on Claudia, the woman who once strode down the aisle as if she controlled everything, now standing with her head bowed, her hands clenched tightly together like someone awaiting their sentence. Victor did not shout, nor did he need to raise his voice, but his complete composure made the situation all the more serious. He looked at Claudia once more, his gaze not filled with rage, but with the deep disappointment of a leader who witnessed one of his own break the core values he had built for so long. "We will handle this thoroughly." He concluded, his voice light as a breath but heavy as stone, not out of personal vengeance, but because it is our responsibility to uphold fairness and honor for this airline. Claudia could only lower her head, unable to find any words to justify herself. She understood that everything she had done, said, and thought was now laid bare before everyone, and now the consequences were irreversible. Behind her, Jaden remained seated quietly, showing no victorious smile, no sense of satisfaction. He simply observed everything with silent calm. for he understood that today the most important thing was not revenge, but the truth being restored to its rightful place before all those who had doubted remained indifferent or stayed silent. And sometimes that alone was enough in the moment. Victor Bennett finished speaking. The atmosphere inside the airplane cabin seemed to thicken. Every eye turned toward Claudia, the woman who had once been so familiar with power but now stood silently, her face as pale as paper. Her trembling lips struggled to suppress something, but ultimately no words came out. The pride that had once enveloped every step, every glance, every word, for so many years now crumbled at her feet, shattering into pieces under the watchful eyes of those who had once feared and respected her. Victor did not take his eyes off Claudia. His gaze was not hostile, not filled with hatred, but it was cold and decisive. Like a knife cutting off any last chance for defense, he took a step forward, stood tall, his hands gently clasped in front of him, his voice low and steady, echoing like the final declaration of a trial in mid-air. I would like to inform from all passengers on this flight that effective immediately, Ms. Claudia Harper, the head flight attendant, is suspended from her duties pending an internal investigation into serious discriminatory behavior that goes against the core values our airline has always upheld. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, as if to confirm that his words were not just for Claudia, but for everyone, present, a reminder that justice was not something hidden in dry administrative documents, but must be enacted clearly, directly, and publicly. We deeply apologize to passenger Jaden Bennett and to all of you for allowing this unacceptable situation to occur, and I promise you, this will never be allowed to happen on any flight of ours again. As soon as the announcement ended for a brief moment, the plane seemed to hold its breath in silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, a clap of hands echoed. At first, it was just a solitary set of hands gently clapping, but it quickly spread like a wave across the cabin. The applause grew louder, resonant, powerful, and decisive, not only in appreciation for Victor's resolute action, but also as a silent release, a quiet unity from those who had witnessed it all but couldn't speak up in time. Jaden gently tilted his head back and quietly scanned the room. He didn't smile, didn't nod. Along with the others, he simply held his calm gaze from beginning to end for Jaden. This was not a victory to celebrate, but a return to the rightful place of fairness, of justice. Something that should have been present from the very first moment he boarded this flight. As for Claudia, standing amid the thunderous applause, her hands clenched into fists, her fingers digging into her palms until they turned white. Each clap felt like a hammer strike on the rotting pride within her, rubbing salt into the humiliation that surged. In waves within her chest, she tried to lower her head as much as possible, as if wanting to shrink herself to the smallest form possible amid the eyes, now openly following her every move. No one laughed out loud, no one mocked her directly, but it was the silence that followed the resounding applause that made Claudia's steps more unstable, more burdened than ever. She slowly turned her back and walked toward the rear of the cabin, like a lost soul trying to escape her own guilt, fully aware that not only her career was hanging by the thinnest thread, but also that the once guarded gazes had now become sentences, without the need for words, and when Claudia disappeared behind the small door at the back of the plane, whispers began to rise again. But this time they weren't expressions of sympathy for Jaden. Instead, They carried a mix of astonishment and satisfaction at the fairness that everyone had thought could only exist in books or stories told from a distance in the economy class among strangers, and eyes that had once been skeptical. Jaden sat quietly. He gently lowered his head, not to hide his emotions, but to silently thank himself for his patience, for keeping his composure from start to finish, and also to thank his father, the man who had not only protected him with power, but also protected him with fairness, with the values that had taught him from a young age. It's not because you are someone's child that you deserve respect, but because you deserve to be treated with respect, like anyone else. When the airplane door closed after Claudia's last step, the atmosphere on the flight seemed to calm. Not because people stopped paying attention to the incident, but because the outcome had been decided publicly, straightforwardly, and justly. Order was restored, but it was a new order, one built on fairness, on the voice of righteousness that had previously been silenced. That day did not merely end with an internal disciplinary action, but mark the beginning of a deep reform within the prestigious airline led by Victor Bennett. He didn't let the incident pass as a mere isolated event that would be forgotten immediately after the flight landed and the matter was fully clarified. Victor called an urgent meeting with the top management demanding a review of the entire service process. More importantly, he instituted mandatory training programs on equality and anti-discrimination for all employees, from flight attendants and technicians to management. The training didn't stop at dry theoretical rules on conduct. It included candid discussions and realistic role-playing scenarios where employees had to confront their own unconscious biases. They had to reflect on whether they had ever inadvertently brought prejudice into their work. Real-life stories like Jaden were included in the curriculum as a vivid reminder that even a single misguided glance, a careless remark, or a small action tinged with bias could deeply wound a person's self-esteem and cause lasting harm. And in the midst of this quiet but powerful change, Claudia Harper's name was neither forgotten nor buried after a long time away from her position. Once the public uproar subsided, Claudia wrote a letter to the board of directors and Victor Bennett. It wasn't to beg for forgiveness or ask for a simple opportunity to return, but a letter from the bottom of her heart where she had spent enough time reflecting on herself, realizing that the mistake wasn't just in her actions that day, but the result of ingrained thoughts over the years. In the letter, she expressed the humiliation she felt, not only from being publicly disciplined, but also from realizing that for so long she had been living and working in a glass cage of arrogance and prejudice that she hadn't even noticed. The letter concluded with a sincere request to rejoin the training programs, not as a teacher, but as a true student, to relearn how to serve in the fairest and most deserving way possible. After several private meetings and considerations based on the humanistic principles Victor always upheld, the airline decided to give Claudia a chance to make amends. She was allowed to return to work, but in a trial role under special supervision, with the primary task not only to serve passengers, but also to relearn what it meant to truly serve, not with polite manners, but with a heart that respects every person on each flight, regardless of who they are. And then on another day, on another flight, the sky was clearer and calmer than ever. Victor Bennett and Jaden walked together into the first-class cabin like any other passengers, without fanfare or arrogance. They simply enjoyed a private journey after all the storms they had weathered. Jaden sat in his seat, gazing out the window at the billowy white clouds. Drifting by, the atmosphere inside the cabin that day was peaceful and gentle, with warm, welcoming smiles from the professional flight attendant, who now served not with judging eyes, but with absolute respect for every passenger. No one knew the story behind the young man silently sitting by the window, nor did anyone care to ask who his father was, for kindness had become the common standard, no longer a privilege for the special few, as the plane slowly glided through the vast sky. Jaden smiled, turning to look at his father, his eyes reflecting a calm that only those who had endured injustice and stood up for what was right could fully understand. Victor nodded a silent agreement between two men from different generations, sharing a belief that fairness is not a gift bestowed by anyone, but something to be preserved through action, through speech, and most importantly, through the unwavering persistence in the face of wrongdoing. And sometimes it only takes one person to stand up at the right moment to change an entire journey. Thus, Jaden's journey ended not only with justice being rightfully restored, but also with profound, long-lasting changes in how people treat one another, regardless of skin color or background. The story also serves as a reminder that with enough determination and dignity, the truth and righteousness will speak for themselves if you were a passenger on that flight. What would you do if you witnessed such an injustice? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you find this story inspiring and thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share to spread this positive message to more people, and subscribe to the channel for more profound and meaningful stories. See you on the next journey.